All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Apples in America History with Sarah Wassberg Johnson, the food historian. My name is Krista. I'm one of the programming librarians here in Poughkeepsie. So please welcome me in joining Sarah. Sarah has recently been featured on the History Channel program, The Food That Built America. So I think it's pretty safe to say she knows a lot about her food. And I currently have you all muted for now, but we'll have time at the end of the presentation for any questions you might have, any comments. So you can either type that in the chat when we have question time, or you'll be able to unmute yourself. Oh, please just turn off your video, please. And you'll be able to unmute yourself at the end of the presentation. Okay, so that's all my spiel. Without further ado, take it away, Sarah.
Thanks for the introduction, Krista. Thanks everyone also for joining us tonight. I'm pretty excited about this talk. This is a new talk that I've put together, but it's a topic I've been studying for about 5 years now, and apples in general are near and dear to my heart. So I'm very happy to be chatting with you about this today. So I'm just gonna go ahead and get started, I think. So I thought we would start with this kind of iconic image. This is a little picture called Stealing Apples from 1877. Sorry. So there's this older man, an old farmer outside this enormous apple tree, right? And he's got a young boy by the ear who's got apples in his pockets, and his hat is full of apples. And there's another boy trying to get away over the fence, and the dog has him by the trousers. And this is just sort of quintessential 19th century Americana when it comes to apples in America, kind of representing kind of American pastoral history, right? But things are not quite as they seem, right? So we're going to talk a little bit about all the different ways apples were used throughout history and kind of how they've influenced American cuisine. So I thought we'd start a little bit with the origins of apples. So apples are not native to North America. They are native to the Tian Shan Mountains in Kazakhstan, on the border between Kazakhstan and China. And in particular, near a city called Alami, which is actually comes from the phrase Al-Amati, which means father of apples. So that's sort of like the homeland of apples. And there are wild apple forests in the Tian Shan Mountains. And apples are a little bit unique compared to a lot of fruits because if you plant an apple seed, the plant that you're going to get from an apple seed is going to be genetically completely different from its parent, right, from the apple itself. So that means that propagation is a little bit different for eating apples, which we'll get into in a second. And apples had a lot of different uses throughout history, one of which was alcohol, which we'll be talking about shortly. So this is a map of the border between Kazakhstan and China, and you can see the Tian Shan Mountains are that brown bit in the middle. And if you look near Lake Issyk, right above is the city of Almaty. So that's kind of the northern slope of the Tian Shan Mountains is where most of the apple forests are, because the southern slope is bordering an enormous desert. So it's a little bit different climate on the southern slope of those mountains. So apples, how did apples get from Kazakhstan to the rest of the world? Largely on the Silk Road. So this is a great little map I found showing some of the varieties and types of apples that traveled along the Silk Road to Europe, and then also further into Asia. And then of course, from Europe, they spread to the New World, to North and South America, but primarily North America. This is, I don't know if you are familiar with or remember from high school, a Punnett square. So this is a Punnett square, an example of a Punnett square showing dominant and recessive genes between two parents, one with two recessive genes for yellow pods, and one with one dominant gene for green pods, and kind of all the genetic variations you can have from those two parents. So apple genetics are similar, but a little bit more complex. So apples are pollinated by wildlife, largely bees, orchard bees in particular. And because the bees are carrying pollen from thousands of different trees, potentially, and different apple trees can be pollinated, cross-pollinated by some apple trees, but not others, depending on the variety. But essentially, it's carrying a lot of genetic data that you don't necessarily know where it's coming from. And so the resulting apple is genetically completely different from the host parent. I shouldn't say the apple, the resulting seed is completely different from the host parent. So the apple, of course, being the fruit, and the seed carrying the genetic material. So you can plant apple trees from seed. There's just no guarantee of what you're going to get. And because of that, humans have developed a special type of technology called grafting, where you take a branch from an apple tree that produces apples that you like, and you graft it onto another tree. And that's how you get basically a clone of the good apple. And that's how you reproduce apples reliably so that you get the same kind of apple. So any apple that you've bought in the grocery store, anytime you go to an orchard, any specific variety of apple is a clone of the original tree, largely, or a clone of a clone, kind of how that works. All right, so I said one of the early uses of apples is actually to make alcohol. So I thought we'd talk a little bit about hard cider and how hard cider is made. So these images are from 2009, so fairly recently, but they're at a historic apple press on the island of Jersey, which is in the English Channel between England and France. England and France both have very strong apple traditions. England in particular is known for its hard cider, but also Normandy in France, which is on the northern coast, is also known for its apple production and for Calvados, which is like an apple brandy. So here they are grinding up the apples in a horse-drawn stone grinder. And you can kind of see the press in the background, but it's also in this next picture. So this is an enormous press. You can see the grinder in the background. And it's got a cloth in the bottom. And so what they would do is they would take the ground up apples and put them in the bottom of the press and then like put the cloth up over the sides so that when you press the apple pulp, it doesn't just spill out of the sides, right? And they make many layers of these layers of cloth, and they're called cheeses. And you can see they have all these layers of apple pulp in these cheeses, and they're pressing it, and the juice is coming out the bottom. And then this is the pomace that's left over with all the juice. Press it out of it. It's kind of like just dry, fibrous material is left, like the skins and the pulp. And the seeds, which will be important. We'll get to that in a minute. So freshly pressed cider is known as sweet cider, right? To differentiate it from hard cider. So hard cider is what happens when you kind of just leave the cider out and it collects wild yeast, and the wild yeast eat the sugars in the cider and make alcohol, right? And depending on the yeast, they also create bubbles, right? So it gets bubbly. And then another step you can take in the life of cider is you can use a specific kind of yeast to turn into wine, so it doesn't get bubbly. Or you can distill the hard cider into apple brandy. And normally how they would do that in the early days was you wouldn't use like a still or a distillery. You would freeze it. So you would freeze it and then skim the ice off, and that was the water coming out of the alcohol. And so you're just concentrating it down to alcohol. You freeze it again and again and again until you get a condensed alcohol at the end. And then finally, if you leave your hard cider long enough or your apple wine long enough, it will turn into vinegar, apple cider vinegar, right? So that's kind of the life cycle of cider and how people preserved apples. People did, of course, eat apples and dry them. And one of the reasons why apples become such a popular fruit is because they have fairly decent long storage, unlike softer fruits like stone fruits and berries and things like that. Apples tend to store better over the winter, but people did also process them into cider and other things, which we'll get to later. So talking about the United States and early America. So obviously European immigrants brought apples over to North America. North America does actually have one native variety of crab apple, but it does not have any eating apples as we know them today. And the founding fathers were quite fond of apples in alcohol form. If I put hard cider the breakfast of champions, because that's how a lot of people were consuming alcohol. And the picture I have here is actually Patrick Henry appearing before the Virginia House of Burgesses. But I have the Virginia House of Burgesses here because George Washington, when he was running for the Virginia House of Burgesses, actually gave away hard cider as like a campaign tactic to get people to vote for him. John Adams was also incredibly fond of hard cider, and he did actually have it for breakfast every day, so that's why I put it in here. And Thomas Jefferson also enjoyed hard cider, and as an agriculturalist was very interested in the different varieties of apples that were available at the time. So I did want to talk a little bit about alcohol consumption in early America, because it's not really how we think of alcohol consumption today. It was kind of intense for a variety of reasons, which I'll get to, but I want to talk about this constitutional bar tab. So this is in Philadelphia after the Constitutional Convention. We kind of finalized writing the Constitution. George Washington and a bunch of other delegates go to a bar in Philadelphia and they consume 54 bottles of Madeira, 60 bottles of claret, 22 bottles of porter, which is a type of beer, 12 bottles of beer, which is probably just ale. Only 8 bottles of cider, which I think is because cider is kind of a more everyday drink, not a special occasion drink. And 7 large bowls of punch. And punch is like, usually contains hard liquor, right? Distilled alcohol, kind of a lot of it usually, probably would have been rum and wine and tea and fruit and all sorts of other things. So all told, 45 gallons of alcohol. So their bar tab included dinner, snacks, cigars, spermaceti candles, which are a very expensive form of candle made from sperm whales. They broke a bunch of glassware, and the 45 gallons does not include the alcohol that the musicians consumed. So they also had musicians there. And the musicians are not included in the total number of people. So their total cost in 1787 in pounds was 89 pounds. And they did a little figuring with the help of an internet calculator. And it came up that the total cost in $2020 was $14,800.70. And here's the kicker. The total number of people at this party was 55. So 55 people in one party consumed 45 gallons of alcohol, which is kind of crazy to think about. So the party included George Washington and other constitutional delegates and the Philadelphia Light Troop of Horse, which was a local militia unit who had been, kind of involved in the American Revolution, and then they were still the Philadelphia militia unit. So they helped with the celebration for sure. So the reason why there's so much alcohol consumption, I'll talk a little bit more about this later too, has to do with sanitation for one, but also just the culture of alcohol consumption. People drank alcohol at almost every meal, and particularly at celebrations, there was a lot of alcohol consumption going on, especially punch, which contained a lot of hard liquor, and wine was like upper class beverages for celebrations. So I thought it'd be fun to go over some of the early American varieties of apple, because there are quite a few that are invented or discovered here in the New World, some quite early. So we have the Roxbury Russet from 1640 in Massachusetts, the Rhode Island Greening from 1650 in Rhode Island, obviously. Rhode Island Greening is still a variety that you can get and plant in your yard. Esopus Spitzenberg from the early 1700s here in the Hudson Valley, Ulster County and Esopus, very near modern day Kingston. Esopus Spitzenberg was also said to be a favorite of Thomas Jefferson. We have the Baldwin from the 1740s in Massachusetts, the Newtown Pippin, which is another variety that's still around, 1759 in Queens. Northern Spy, personal favorite of my husband's, around 1800 in New York. The Grimes Golden in Virginia, the Wine Sap in New Jersey, which is now most often seen as the Stamen Wine Sap. It's a cross. The Jonathan, also in New York, the Pound Sweet in Connecticut, the Arkansas Black, which if you know, have been following heirloom apples, you've maybe seen articles on Gastro Obscure or seen it in the news, because it is a very beautiful apple. And then the Stamen from Kansas. So like I said, the Stamen and wine sap were crossed. And that's a very common heirloom apple that's still around today. So I wanted to talk a little bit about Johnny Appleseed, right, as our quintessential American myth around apples, except for it's not actually a myth. So maybe you grew up seeing the Disney cartoon about Johnny Appleseed or hearing the song, right? So he was a real person. His name was John Chapman. He was born in 1774 in Massachusetts. And in 1792, he's not that old, he travels west with his younger brother, Nathaniel. His mother had died and his father had remarried. And the new wife, they were having kids. So that, you know, him and his brother were kind of like, let's get out of here, we're old enough. So they start traveling west and they end up in Warren, Pennsylvania. And Pennsylvania was a big apple producing region at that time. And they find themselves, you know, outside of all these big cideries that are producing sweet cider and hard cider. And Johnny realizes that they're pitching all this pomace, right? The leftover stuff from the pressing. Well, guess what? The pomace is full of apple seeds. So he starts picking through the pomace and collecting all these apple seeds. And his scheme is that they're going to plant these apple seeds and grow trees and sell them to new settlers on the frontier. So that's exactly what they do. He also converts to Swedenborgianism, which is a type of Christianity based on the teachings of, I want to say Emil Swedenborg. I forget his first name. But essentially, he becomes a missionary and he makes his way across the frontier, planting little seedling orchards, right? So he plants his apple seeds and then he builds like thickets of brush around them to serve as kind of a natural barrier to keep animals out of the orchards. And then he walks a circuit. So he circles back around every year or so to check on his seedlings. And when they're big enough, he sells them to European settlers coming into the frontier areas. And the reason why he's doing seeds and not grafting has to do with his Swedenborgian beliefs. He believed that grafting was anathema to God. God had created the seeds, and so that was the best way to plant apple trees. He was also a vegetarian, didn't believe in animal cruelty. Sometimes he would purchase abused animals and leave them with settlers who he thought would be not kinder to them. You know, there's lots of apocryphal stories about him being kind to children and making sure that children were fed first, which was not the norm for hospitality at the time. You know, of course, the guest came first, and if the kids had to go hungry, oh well, but he was not that kind of person, or so the stories go. He ends up all the way out in Fort Wayne, Indiana, in 1845, which is where he dies. But essentially, his apple orchards helped improve the land as settlers moved west. So he was kind of like the ultimate pioneer coming in advance of European settlement. All right, so John Chapman dies in 1845. And throughout the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, that was the time of like real peace and prosperity in the United States right after the War of 1812. And there was a lot of emphasis on agriculturalism. But in the election of 1840, hard cider kind of takes center stage again. So in 1840, Martin Van Buren was the Democratic president, right? He was the incumbent, also known as OK or Old Kinderhook. But he had not done very well with the Panic of 1837. There was a big bank panic, which led to a financial recession, and he had not handled that particularly well. So he was not very well liked. Sadly, our New York, one of our New York presidents was not super well liked. And his challenger was William Henry Harrison, who was a Whig. And this is actually the first time that the Whig Party really ran a presidential candidate William Henry Harrison was known as Tippecanoe because he had fought in the Battle of Tippecanoe in the War of 1812. So Tippecanoe and Tyler too was one of their slogans. And he was really aided by universal white male suffrage. So prior to the election of 1840, in most states, you had to be a landowner in order to vote. But by 1840, most states had passed universal white male suffrage laws that allowed everybody to vote. And William Henry Harrison was kind of like the rough and ready, everyday man, populist candidate in many ways. So he won the election of 1840. And I have here on the side a piece of sheet music called Good Hard Cider, a favorite patriotic ballad respectfully dedicated to the officers and members of the Tippecanoe Associations of New York. And the reason why it's called Good Hard Cider is because he was known as the log cabin and hard cider candidate. So he was very popular in Western states and territories. And this image, you can see he's standing in front of the log cabin, which is kind of representative of the American frontier. He's in his shirt sleeves, so he's very casual. He's welcoming some soldiers to his house, giving them hard cider, right? That's his form of hospitality. And then there's an American flag that says Harrison and Tyler, right? So this is a little campaign image that they used. And then poor Martin Van Buren is not very well depicted in a lot of political cartoons at the time. This is him running out of the White House in his nightshirt. And you can see his nightcap is flying off his little bald head. And he's being chased by an apparition of a barrel of hard cider with William Henry Harrison's face on it. And he's encountering on the steps of the White House Senator John Calhoun and Thomas Hart Benton, who were both kind of like political allies. And I won't get into the super long captions, but it's Van Buren kind of going on this long sort of Shakespearean rant about this nightmare that he's having. So this is from the Library of Congress. If you want to look it up and read the original, you can. This one is a little bit more simplistic. It's poor Martin Van Buren following Andrew Jackson on the road to the White House. So there's one sign that says to Kinderhook, but it also says okay, right, for Old Kinderhook. And then there's another one that says to the White House. And the top of the signpost is a little log cabin. And then strewn over the road are barrels of hard cider and log cabins. And it says a hard row to hoe, or the White House Turnpike macadamized by the North Benders. So macadam and macadamizing was a road improvement where you put crushed stone and sometimes also tar or pitch on the roads to make like a more a smoother road surface. But here, the macadam, the macadam is actually the giant barrels of hard cider and log cabins. So that's why it's a hard road to hoe, because the North Benders have like strewn all of these obstacles in his path. And he's also got a giant load of sub-treasury on his back. So that's his handling of the bank panic. So he's not doing too hot in his election. Of course, he ultimately loses that election. He's just a one-term candidate. All right, so hard cider in the 1840s was still considered a fairly wholesome drink, although its association with William Henry Harrison took on kind of like a rough and tumble frontiersman soldiery kind of connotation. And by the latter half of the 19th century, the temperance movement really sort of turned its eye toward hard cider. So this is another political cartoon about a very early liquor law, the Maine Liquor Law of 1851. And it's mocking presidential candidate Franklin Pierce. So here we have Pierce is like holding up his bottle of whatever alcohol. He's leaning on the tree and he's being passed by a Quaker on horseback who's got the Maine Liquor Law in his hand. And the Quaker says, "Friend, that tree looks as if it was old enough to stand alone. Thee need not hold it up any longer." So of course he's implying that Pierce is drunk, and that's why he's leaning against the tree, right? It's a joke that, oh, I'm leaning against the tree to hold it up, but no, actually the tree is holding him up. And Pierce says, "You have the advantage of me, stranger." Like he's slurring his words. He says, "My name is Frank Pierce. I'll stand as long as this tree will stand by me. I'm granite all over." Of course, Maine is the granite state. "Give us your hand. Will you take a horn? I'll give you a toast. Here's confusion to all Maine liquor laws." So he's offering a horn, right? So he's going to give him a drink, which of course the Quaker is professing temperance, but he's got a barrel of hard cider on the back of his horse, which could be one of two things. It could be either he's a supporter of the Whigs, right? So that's the association of hard cider with William Henry Harrison and the Whigs continues through the 19th century, or he's not actually that much of a prohibitionist as he says he is, right? So this is hard cider continuing to represent both politics and prohibition through the 19th century. So as we get later into the century, you do get more home production, right? Cider becomes more and more of a homemade beverage. Part of that, as I said earlier, had to do with sanitation. A lot of people didn't really trust water sources for drinking, with good reason. In the 1840s and 50s in particular, we were starting to realize that there were waterborne illnesses. And so you started to get early efforts at sanitation, but alcohol was still the surefire way to make sure that whatever you were drinking was safe, right? We didn't really understand why. We didn't have germ theory and Louis Pasteur yet, but we were getting there. Most of the apples grown in the United States were actually cider apples, right? In part due to people like Johnny Appleseed who were planting apples from seed. Marginal apples for eating actually made pretty good apples for cider. You don't want them super high in sugar or you get too much alcohol, right? A lot of heirloom cider apples are sometimes called bitter sharps because they're not particularly sweet. Cider remains mostly a homemade beverage because you kind of had to live where there were apple trees. You kind of had to have your own apple orchard. You had to have a volume of apples to be able to make cider. And as I referenced earlier, pretty much everybody was drinking cider, including children, right? It was considered a fairly low alcohol, safe beverage for women and children to drink, for families to drink. And with the William Henry Harrison, it kind of had like this place in popular culture where it was, you know, kind of a down-home, homemade, wholesome beverage. But that starts to change in the latter half of the 19th century. So early in the 19th century, temperance movement had focused primarily on hard distilled alcohol as the most damaging. But as the movement got a little bit more entrenched and a little bit more severe as the century wore on, they started to target hard cider as well. And this is Hard Cider, a Temperance Sketch, was written by T.S. Dennison and published in 1880. And it's a little play. It's a little moralizing play meant to be performed by temperance societies for local events. It's very short. You can find it online. It's set in a family home, and hard cider is the primary topic. So it's a family who has a guest over, and they want to be hospitable, so they offer him cider, and he brings wine, but there's a woman there who is a temperance advocate who is talking against hard cider, and there's a whole argument about whether hard cider is the wholesome, homely beverage that the men in the family think it is, or if it is the road to ruin, right? So she says cider leads to wine, wine to whiskey, and whiskey to ruin. So cider is like the gateway alcohol in the minds of temperance reformers. So that by the end of the play, they had been alternating hard cider and wine throughout the play. And by the end of the play, they get very drunk. The next morning, the men wake up and they're all contrite, and they apologize to the woman, and they offer to sign the temperance pledge, which is like, you're not going to touch a drop of alcohol, right? That's a very popular thing for temperance reformers to get people to do, is to sign the pledge. And if you break your word, then it's a thing of honor, right? So here we have another little cartoon with hard cider and the temperance movement in it. This is not dated. It's probably from the late 19th century. It's a rural game of baseball. All kinds of crazy things are happening. There's ducks, there's a dog. And in the background, you can see by the spectators, there's a barrel of hard cider. So there's a guy selling hard cider. And then it says WCTU fresh milk, 2 cents a glass. So the WCTU is the Women's Christian Temperance Union. And so in an effort to combat the consumption of hard cider, they're selling fresh milk, and they literally have a cow there that they're milking into the cups. And I find it interesting that in the cartoon, there's a bunch of men drinking milk, but nobody's taking up the hard cider purveyor on his offer. This is also from the Library of Congress. All right, so there has been much discussion about the death of hard cider in the 19th and early 20th century. A lot of people place the blame on temperance, and it does play a role, but it's not the only role, because even by the time of William Henry Harrison, hard cider consumption was kind of on the decline. And that has to do with a shift in drinking habits. So in the first half of the 19th century, regional distilling got a lot more technologically advanced and a lot easier to produce. So we had a lot of whiskey and bourbon production. Then of course we still have rum coming up from the Caribbean. And then more and more people were drinking wine, right? Imported wine became cheaper. But in large part, it was the hard alcohol, the shift to drinking hard alcohol, that meant that cider production and consumption started to decline. And that's why hard alcohol was really the first target of the temperance movement. But the other thing that happens in the 1840s, again, this kind of watershed moment for hard cider, is that we start to get German immigrants, and they bring over a different style of beer making. In particular, they bring over lager yeast, I guess, for lack of a better word. So if you have hops, you can make ale out of anything, including pumpkins, which people did in the 18th century. Lager is a little bit more temperamental. Ale you can brew at any temperature. Lager has to be near freezing. It's a cold brewing process, but it makes a much different beverage. So lagers are usually pale golden in color. They're fairly effervescent. They're fairly light in alcohol content. And what does that sound like? That sounds like hard cider, right? So you get people kind of moving away from hard cider and toward lager. And then also Germans brought with them saloon culture. So lager kind of has a similar place in German culture as hard cider did in American culture, although even more emphasis on like children and women, and saloons were very like family spaces and beer gardens. And the temperance reformers hated that. So there was actually a lot of really negative targeting of German immigrants based on their saloon culture, which is, if you've ever been to the Tenement Museum in New York City, they do talk about that a little bit. And then of course, the other thing that's happening is you have a lot of domestic immigration. So prior to the American Civil War, there wasn't that much westward expansion. It was relatively slow. We were starting to get canals. We were starting to get railroads in the 1830s. But prior to that, most people did not move that far from where they lived or where they grew up. But once we get canals and railroads, and particularly after the Civil War, you get a lot more domestic immigration. People are moving far away from where they grew up, and people are not staying in one place for as long. So apple orchards are not really getting as established, or they're not as common. And particularly as people move into the northern Great Plains, where it's really difficult to grow apples, so they move into the American Southwest, where it's really difficult to grow apples. The availability of apples for home cider production really starts to decline. And then the other thing that's happening is most commercial apple production switches to what are known as dessert apples. So now, apples that you get every day in the grocery store today are all dessert apples, right? They're not designed to brew cider from, they're designed for people to eat. And so that's where the scientific research is going, that's where the commercial production is going, and that's what people are buying in stores, which is also facilitated by the rise of railroads. So you can ship your apples to a commercial market where previously you didn't have one. So all of these are the contributing factors to the death of hard cider by the early 20th century. All right, so we talked a lot about hard cider. I want to talk a little bit about apples as food. And of course, that quintessential food in America, apple pie, right? So pie in British culture dates back to medieval England. If anybody watches the Great British Baking Show, you've seen them talk about hot water crust. And that is based on a medieval recipe for a crust that was called a coffin. And it was basically designed as a freestanding baking container. You actually weren't meant to eat the crust. It was just to contain and bake the food inside the crust, usually meat, but sometimes fruit. And as that kind of wore on, the crust became more and more edible. And when we imported it from the UK to North America, it became a really quintessential food in colonial America because it was so easy to make. And part of that had to do with the availability of cooking utensils and baking options. So most people in early America had a Dutch oven, and not everybody had a beehive oven. So in Europe, even in medieval England or in, colonial era England, there were village bakers. You had large scale bake ovens. You had people producing food. Commercially, you had big estates that were producing food of, they had all the latest technology. That was not true in early America. Most people were doing their own cooking for their own households. Obviously, there were enslaved people doing a lot of the cooking too, but particularly for smaller households who maybe only had a Dutch oven, pie was the easiest and most caloric dessert you could make. So obviously there were cakes that could be made. There were also cookies or biscuits that could be made, but that was largely reserved for wealthier households. Apple pie was kind of like the everyman dessert, right? The fruit was available for a long time throughout the year, especially if you had dried fruit, you could have dried apple pie. And it was just a really accessible kind of everyman dessert. And for that reason, pie has become kind of the quintessential American food that are popular across social strata, across racial and religious lines, across gender lines. People eat pie for breakfast, particularly in rural areas where you're doing work before you eat and you're burning a lot of calories throughout the day. Apple pie in particular was a favorite at breakfast. People who live in urban areas in the later part of the 20th century, particularly poor people who maybe don't have access to kitchens, store-bought pie has become a very cheap and accessible food. People would go to luncheon counters or tea rooms and have like pie and coffee for lunch. Poor people would buy pies off of push carts. They did become the target in the progressive era of health reformers who thought that they were, heavy and indigestible and who knew what was in them, which is probably true. But then they also maintained their status as both a dessert after the main noon meal in rural areas and after evening meals in urban areas. All right, so I thought I would share a very early recipe for American pie. Amelia Simmons wrote probably the first American cookbook published in our very young United States. It was first published in 1876. This version is from 1896. This version is from 1898. So she has a recipe for apple pie. And she says, stew and strain the apples to every 3 pints. Grate the peel of a fresh lemon, add cinnamon, mace, and rose water to taste. Bake in paste number 3. So this is a common trick that you would use if you were doing hearth cooking, which is you cook the filling before you bake the pie. So as we get better ovens over the years, especially as we start to get cast iron, freestanding stoves, Franklin stoves, that kind of thing, we start to put raw apples in and bake the apples within the pie crust, very medieval of us. But in the colonial period, it was much easier to cook the filling first because then you were not as likely to burn the pie crust, right, if you're cooking in a Dutch oven. So I also looked up paste number 3 in her book, and it's a little confusing. It says to any quantity of flour, add 3/4 of its weight in butter. And then it says in parentheses, 12 eggs to a peck. So I don't know if that's her version, like that's how you figure out, how much a peck is. If you weigh 12 eggs, you can weigh the butter. I'm not super clear. But then she says to rub in 1/3 or half and roll in the rest. So I think that means that you're supposed to cut in 1/3 or half of the butter. And then as you're rolling it out, almost like a puff paste, to put the butter in between the layers of the dough and fold and roll to fold and roll. That's my interpretation anyway of what she's saying. So an interesting apple pie if you want to try it at home. We do also get mock apple pie. Now, many of you have probably heard of mock apple pie. Ritz Crackers came out with a recipe pretty early on. Most people attribute it to the Great Depression. However, it does not date to the Great Depression. It actually dates to the 1850s. So this recipe calls for breadcrumbs. And then what makes it taste like apples is tartaric acid, which is a byproduct, I believe, of the wine industry. I always forget this. But essentially, it's a commercially available acid, which makes it taste sour, right? And then she says this is an excellent substitute when apples are scarce. Then there's another one from 1857, also called cracker pie, which instead of breadcrumbs uses crackers. And the kind of crackers they're talking about are more like pilot crackers or hardtack, which was commercially available, and a lot of people did use them. But again, she's using tartaric acid. Later recipes later in the century call for the use of lemon juice, which would have been more available later in the century thanks to refrigerated railroad cars. But I think it's interesting that apple pie is like so entrenched in our culture at this point that even when you don't have apples, you're trying to make a version of apple pie. So just a couple of images here. This is the cover of A Apple Pie by Kate Greenaway from 1900. This is a little alphabet book designed for children. So each letter of the alphabet is something different about the pie. And so of course, E is for eat it. And it is from 1900, even though Kate Greenaway's illustrations look like turn of the 19th century, colonial period. She is publishing these in the 1900s. And then there's the phrase, as American or apple pie. And I put as American as apple pie or corn pone because that's my favorite version of this phrase. So the first references to apple pie being American in print are in 1881. And then in 1890, there's a reference from Queen Victoria where she requests her bakers to make American apple pie, as opposed to maybe French or British apple pie. She wants the American version. As American as Apple Pie first appears in print in a 1910 theater review. Henry Fink, in his 1913 book, Food and a Flavor, talks about how American pie is representative of the United States. And he says, apple pie is ours as much as our flag. And then my favorite is the New York Times describing First Lady Lou Hoover's homemaking skills in 1928. And they describe them as American as apple pie or corn pone. And of course, corn pone is actually more American in some ways because corn is indigenous to America, right? And corn pone is a very colonial and even indigenous food way. But I think because apple pie is a dessert, and people generally like desserts more than they like breads, that's why apple pie, American as apple pie, is the one that wins out. There are also, oops, sorry, that's my dog. There are also innumerable other apple desserts. There's apple dumplings, pandowny. From France, we get tarte tatin, apple crisp, baked apples, apple pudding. There is actually an Amelia, I think it's Amelia Simmons, another recipe for an apple pie that calls for like pureed apples. That's more like a pumpkin pie, right? But it's actually a pudding. There's also boiled apple puddings. And of course, we do have a lot of different ways that apples are cooked in more savory manners. So apples and pork, combining apples and pork dates back to Roman times and is widely used throughout Europe and of course the United States, in large part because pigs are very easy to raise on marginal land. And if you have an apple orchard, they sure like to eat those fallen apples. Apples and onions is another kind of American invention. If you read Laura Ingalls Wilder, there's a reference to an In Farmer Boy. I think it's delicious too. Of course, you also get apple sauce, which can be served as dessert or as a side dish to meat or other foods. You get apple butter, which again is used more like a jam. Apple jelly, and dried apples. Dried apples, I think, are a really important and overlooked way of preserving apples that are not very good for eating fresh. So they're more like the sour apples or the apples that you would use to make cider. And the Pennsylvania Dutch in particular are very well known for their dried apple uses. And so they have a couple of recipes. One is Himmel und Erde, which is heaven and earth. So it's apples and potatoes, sometimes mashed together, usually served with some sort of sausage, pork sausage, and fried onions. And then there's Schnitz and Knepp. So the Schnitz is the dried apples, cut up dried apples, and Knepp means button, and that's a reference to dumplings. So if you were poor, you would just have the dried apples and dumplings together. If you had a little bit of money, you would put some ham in there, again, apples and pork. And then, of course, we have this beautiful photograph from 1907 of a Shaker woman who is cutting up apples for sauce. This one I found because it had a great illustration of the stirring stick. So this is a boy, it's quite late. It looks to be about 1940s. It's from the University of North Texas. And there's a boy who is stirring apple butter. And so the apple butter is in this big cauldron over an open flame. And the stirring stick, you see this in a lot of places. It's very, I shouldn't say it's strange. It's very unique. It's a long stick, right? So you don't have to get too close to the fire, with a board. And then the bottom of the board has holes in it. And it's so that you are like pushing the board constantly, scraping the bottom, pushing it through the apple butter. So the apple butter kind of goes through the holes in the board. And it's to prevent the apple butter from burning while it's boiling and bubbling and all the liquid is evaporating out of it. And apple butter is made with both with apples and apple cider. And then of course you add all kinds of spices, and it boils down to this really thick substance that keeps very well. They would put it in crocks, and then you use it as a spread, almost like a jam. All right, so once we get into the 20th century, we start to get some more commercial production of applesauce and apple butter. So we have Musselman's, which was founded in 1907 in Pennsylvania. The Musselman family actually purchased an existing canning company. A lot of commercial canning was very regional at the turn of the 20th century. And so some of the bigger canning companies started to buy up a lot of the smaller ones, but the Musselmans bought their own regional canning company. And because they lived in Pennsylvania, which had a ton of apple producers, they started marketing specific apple products. They made applesauce, apple butter, and apple juice and sweet cider. And if you're wondering what the difference is between apple juice and sweet cider, apple juice is filtered and sweet cider is not. Sweet cider is also not homogenized. So those little teeny bits of pulp from the apple are left in. And apple juice is usually a lot sweeter, both from the varieties and also the filtering and pasteurizing process. And then interestingly, in 1984, the Musselman's company was purchased from the family by the fruit growers. So it's a grower-owned cooperative, which was kind of cool. And then of course I found this advertisement from the 1960s, which really plays up the Pennsylvania Dutch aspect. It says an exclusive blend of choice apples and a Pennsylvania Dutch applesauce recipe has made Musselman's Apple Capital USA. It's got the cute little doll in there, right? You may have not known also that H.J. Heinz Company, most famous for ketchup, also got into the apple butter game. They were founded in 1869. And they're starting to produce apple butter by the 1870s, and by the 1900s, apple butter is one of their most popular products. So here is a picture from 1900 from the Heinz History Center of the Heinz apple butter department. And you can kind of see the big cauldrons that they have with the big stirring things, and they're using that to make their apple butter. Not clear if they're packing it in the barrels or if the apples are coming out of the barrels, but that's what's going on in there. And now we come to my favorite story, the sad tale of the Red Delicious. So if you enjoy apples at all, you've probably had a Red Delicious and been sadly disappointed. But things were not always so in the world of Red Delicious. Red Delicious started out because the Stark Brothers Nursery in Louisiana, Missouri, was looking for an apple to replace the Ben Davis. So the Ben Davis is an heirloom apple that was very popular in the mid to latter half of the 19th century because it stored very well and it didn't bruise easily and it was easy to grow, but it didn't taste very good. So it's kind of like ticked off all the boxes that the farmers wanted, but it wasn't actually that great of an apple. So the Stark brothers were like on the hunt for a new apple, and they were kind of like riding circuit around the Midwest, searching for a new type of apple, and not having a whole lot of luck. Meanwhile, in Peru, Iowa, a guy by the name of Jesse Hyatt had an apple orchard, and there was this rogue apple sapling that popped up. So he chopped it down, and then it came back up the next year, and he chopped it down again, and it came back up the next year, and he decided he was going to keep it. This is in 1870, and just kind of see what it does. And it ends up producing, by about 1880, like 10 years later, it ends up producing these really delicious but kind of weird apples. They're like oblong. The bottom is almost square. They've got these weird bumps on the bottom, and it's red and yellow striped. But it tastes amazing. So by this time, the Stark brothers are tired of like riding circuit around trying to find new varieties of apples. So they decide in 1893, they come up with this idea that they're going to make the apples come to them. So they host the International New Fruit Show, and they put out a call for all kinds of new varieties of fruits. People send in their varieties of fruits, but apples are kind of the star of the show. And Jesse Hyatt submits his apple, which he calls Hawkeye, because he's from Iowa. And it goes through all the judging, and Clarence Stark, who's one of the brothers that owns Stark Brothers, tastes the apple and he says, "My, that's delicious." But the submission card that came with the apple was lost. So they didn't know who submitted the apple. So the following year, for the fruit show, the new fruit show the following year, they actually sent out to everybody who submitted and invited them to submit again. So Jesse Hyatt submits again, and of course his apple wins the show again. So the Stark brothers were kind of like looking for their glass slipper. Who did the glass slipper fit? And they find Jesse Hyatt. So they buy the Hawkeye tree from him. They start grafting it onto new trees and producing what they call Stark's Delicious. So I have this great little picture on the right hand here about the blood red Stark Delicious, which we'll get into in a minute. But they have this whole catalog boasting about this new delicious apple. And they, like I said, they call it Stark's Delicious. This is an image from one of their fruit fairs showing all the different kinds of fruit that they offer, and also people sending in fruit submissions. And I love this. This is from that same 1926 catalog. So this apple becomes so famous that the Iowa State Horticultural Society builds a giant monument to Jesse Hyatt and the Hawkeye, which becomes known as Stark's Delicious, the world's most delicious apple. So how does it get to be red delicious? Well, part of it has to be with the fact that the Stark brothers start to offer in 1914 the golden delicious apple, which is actually named by somebody else and not related to red delicious. So they start calling it red delicious, in part because of a freak genetic accident that happens in New Jersey that they eventually pay $6,000 for. So there is a farmer in New Jersey who is a big Stark Brothers fan. He grows a lot of their apples, and one of them was the Stark's Delicious. So he contacts the Stark Brothers and says, "Hey, listen, I have this weird tree that just one branch of it ripens in August and turns bright red. So when the rest of the tree is green and not ripe, this one branch turns bright red and ripens early, and it's still a Stark Delicious." So the Stark brothers send representatives. They send botanists and horticulturalists to examine this limb, and they end up buying just this limb of the tree for $6,000. And that is where all red delicious come from, is this one genetic aberration of the Stark Delicious tree. So once that happens, they start grafting trees by the thousands, sending them out all over, in particular to the Willamette Valley in Oregon, which is like some of the best apple growing territory in the country. And Red Delicious really starts to be favored when we get apple grading standards. So the standards for apple grading reward color, they reward size, they reward durability. So apples that don't bruise easily, apples that ship well, apples that keep well in cold storage. And Red Delicious checks all those boxes. So Red Delicious is consistently graded the highest of almost all apples in the United States. And so it really starts to be favored by a lot of growers. However, despite its fairly long reign as like the #1 apple in the United States, in the 1990s, we start to get some new competitors. So we get the Gala from New Zealand, we get the Fuji from Japan, and then later on we get the Braeburn from New Zealand. And people start to buy more and more of these apples because even though they're not bright red and they're not that same familiar shape, that oblong shape of Red Delicious, they taste much better. They're much more crisp, they're juicier, they're sweeter, and they have better flavor. And so the poor Red Delicious starts to go into decline. And by 2000, it's such an emergency for orchardists growing Red Delicious that Bill Clinton actually signs a $138 million apple bailout. And each grower who has grown any apples in the last 3 years gets $30,000 to kind of tide them over because the demand for Red Delicious had fallen so precipitously. So that's still kind of continuing today a little bit, right? In 2018, the Gala actually exceeded Red Delicious production, and that is in large part because apple orchardists really started to shift their growing priorities. But it takes a while to establish large-scale production of a new variety of apple. The new one that's kind of on the rise now is Honeycrisp, and you might have started to have seen Zestar in stores now. Those are both University of Minnesota cultivars that again are cultivated for being very crisp, very juicy, very sweet. That is the new trend in apples now, and poor Red Delicious is kind of getting left in the dust. You do find, even though the current Red Delicious is very different from that original Hawkeye, you do find some orchardists, nurseries are starting to offer the Hawkeye Red Delicious, or the Stark's Delicious as alternatives. Whether or not they actually taste like the original, I don't know that we'll ever know, but it's supposed to be a better variety of Red Delicious. So nowadays we do have a little bit of an heirloom revival that starts in the 2000s, right? People who have apple orchards, family apple orchards in particular with old trees, are kind of starting to brand them as people get more and more interested in heirloom varieties. The return of hard cider production really spurs a lot of interest in heirloom varieties. And I actually have a friend who's an oenologist at Cornell University who says that there's such a demand for hard cider now that they just don't have the cider apples, and they're starting to import heirloom varieties from Europe because they're just not available in the United States. You do also get the rise of lost apple societies. Different projects and nonprofits and people who go out into the community to try and find lost varieties of apples. At one point we had thousands of varieties of apples in the United States. Now it's down to hundreds. And we know this because of old orchardist publications that list all of the apples and their qualities and stuff like that. Many of them include watercolor botanical illustrations, like this one here of the wine sap apple. And so they can kind of compare that with varieties that they find. And then they also do, usually it's university extension or university labs that will do some DNA testing on them to see if they can figure out if these apples are actually lost varieties. And then there's people like Fedco Seeds who kind of pioneered the revival of heirloom apples through seedlings and getting people to purchase them and grow them at home or in orchards. And so thanks to these efforts, you can actually get heirloom varieties. You're starting to be able to get heirloom varieties in a lot of stores, which is fantastic. All right. What are your favorites for apples? I'm just going to run through mine quick. My favorite heirloom apples are John Gold, Stamen Winesap, Northern Spy, and Opalescent. Opalescent is actually I've only ever seen in one orchard in New Paltz. I think it's Apple Hill Orchard. We have like 5 gnarly old trees. I haven't been in a couple of years, so I hope they're still there, but those are fantastic apples. My favorite ways to eat them, definitely homemade sauce. We had what my mom thinks is a wealthy apple tree in our backyard when we were growing up, and it would, like, every other year we would just get a ton of apples, so she always made great applesauce. As a kid, I thought apples and onions was gross when I was reading Laura Ingalls Wilder, but now as an adult, I really enjoy it. Apple celery salad, which is like an early version of Waldorf salad without the mayonnaise, please. I'll take mine with vinaigrette. And then apple cake and apple crisp are my other favorite ways to eat it as dessert. Ways to drink. The Stone Fence, which is apple hard cider with spiced rum. I did that for Food History Happy Hour a couple weeks ago. I love mulled sweet cider. And then I also really like sweet cider with ginger ale and cranberry. So I saw some questions in the chat. So I think if people want to start to unmute, I will look in the chat and answer some questions first. Okay, I did answer what's the difference between sweet cider and apple juice, right? Apple juice is filtered and pasteurized. Mandy, any info on where we can buy heirloom apples to try? I don't know where you are living, Mandy, but Adams Fairacre Farms has a pretty good selection of heirloom apples, but definitely if you can try to find some local orchards in your area, a lot of them will list the types of apples that they have available. And I'm also just going to drop this in the chat. There is a great website called orangepippin.com that lets you look up different varieties of apples, and it'll tell you like when they were started, where they're from, what their names are, some of their eating qualities, and sometimes where you can find them, but it's a website that's based in the UK. So I don't know that they have a ton of information about American options, but definitely if you want to call up your local orchard and ask them if they have any heirloom varieties. A lot of them are still focused on the more popular commercial varieties because that's what sells. But especially if it's a family orchard that's been around for a long time, sometimes they have some heirlooms hidden in the back. There are also a couple of orchards in the Hudson Valley that are specifically geared towards heirlooms. Oh, what's the one at Bard College? I'm forgetting the name, but there's the people who bought property from Bard College that have an apple orchard now. They have a bunch of heirloom apples. And then there is the Hudson Valley Apple Project in Ankrum, New York, that is specifically growing all different heirloom varieties for cider production. So you can check them out as well. All right. Mandy, any info on your research on how growers cared for trees before pesticides? So that's a very good question. A lot of apple orcharding to produce good apples has to do with how the trees are pruned. So you can mitigate a lot of damage to your apples by how trees are pruned. They did have some pesticides in the 19th century that they would use. Most of them we don't use now because they're lead based. They're like an arsenic base. That's called arsenates of lead. But I think mostly you just got whatever apples you got, and if you got a wormy one, you either cut around the worm or you got rid of it. You know, people were a little more sanguine about blemishes on fruits and vegetables and damage and stuff like that. That's just, you know, people who are buying today just don't really, they expect everything to be perfect, which is part of the reason why we have the use of so many pesticides and herbicides and fertilizers and all that stuff. So, but most of the damage to modern apples, if it's not coming from pests, which are very difficult to manage sometimes, a lot of the damage is from, you know, being too close to twigs, or, you know, you get bruises because they've been blown around and been hit by the branch. If you see russeting on apples, that's like if there's a little rough brown patch, on the apple. That's because the skin was broken and then it healed over. So I do encourage you, if you're buying heirloom apples, to not be looking too much for perfect apples, because perfect apples are the result of a lot of breeding and pesticides usually. So, all right, any other questions? Chris, I don't know if you want to open it back up. If people want to ask questions orally, they're welcome to.
Yep, you should be able to unmute yourself if you have any questions, or you can put it in the chat. And if not, I guess we can call it a night.
I'm proud of myself. It was like an hour. Yay.
Yes. So if anyone is interested, if you're not already signed up, we have another program with Sarah next week, Tuesday the 17th at 6:30. It's about pumpkin pie in America. What's the title again, Sarah? It's
As American as Pumpkin Pie.
Yes.
I think it's from colonial New England to pumpkin spice lattes.
And you'll be doing cooking demonstration.
I am, yes. I will be cooking pumpkin pie from scratch, and that means cutting up an actual pumpkin and roasting it. So I'll have a little recorded video of me cooking pumpkin pie if anybody is interested in that.
Very cool. So please sign up for that if you're interested. We also have another one in December 8th with Sarah. I think it's Indian meal molasses, the making of New England cuisine. And that's also 6:30 to 8 on Tuesday, December 8th. So please sign up for that. And we'll be doing more stuff with Sarah in the winter, but we'll talk about that more later on.
Yeah.
All right. So everyone have a great night, and thank you again for coming.